Hello everyone. In this video I'm going to be looking at the female reproductive system. Now I'm primarily focusing this video at A-level and IB students because that's when you study the reproductive system in much greater depth and you need to appreciate more of the structure and function of the actual reproductive anatomy. So this is one of two videos. One of them I've done already on the male reproductive anatomy and I've talked through the parts and the functions. So now I'm doing the equivalent for the female. So we're going to start at the very bottom and we'll go in a clockwise direction. So I'm going to label the parts here and then I'm going to just say the jobs of the bits, if you like. So let's start at the bottom. Now this label at the very bottom is for the vagina. Now the vagina is the passageway for the menstrual flow. It's also the receptacle for the penis during intercourse, and it's the lower half of the birth canal. So three main functions there: lower half of the birth canal, receptacle for the penis during intercourse, that's where the penis would be placed, but it's also the passageway for the menstrual flow. So now if we continue, we get to what's called the labia. You can see it's labelled sort of two parts there. The labia are folds of skin. They're folds of skin that ultimately go to protect the opening of the vagina and the clitoris. So that's the job of the labia. Now what we have to the left of the labia is something called the hymen. Now, you might be able to see that the hymen is this, if I just highlight it in red, is this sort of opening part to the vaginal canal. So that's our hymen. And then we come to a structure slightly above that, and it's this one. And I'll colour this part in purple, like I did with the male anatomy. I'll highlight particular regions on this. Now that part there, that is the clitoris. Okay, so the clitoris is the human female's most sensitive erogenous known, and it's the primary source of physical sexual pleasure. So now we've put the clitoris in place, let's continue labelling this diagram. And we start the next section by putting in place the urethra. Now the urethra carries urine from the bladder to the outside. That's the key job of the urethra. So it might be easy to spot which one of these is the bladder. In fact, we'll put the bladder next in place, and it's actually this one here. Now, you'll notice that in front of that bladder, we have this pubic bone. So this portion, kind of similar to the male anatomy, that you've got the pubic bone, and then the bladder and the urethra sort of sitting behind that. But then you'll notice that there's a large structure behind that bladder. And these are the key bits that we need to be able to label. So let's talk about this first part. And I'm going to colour this in green here, just so you can see which bit it is exactly that I'm referring to here. So that part in green there is what we know as the endometrium. So that there is the endometrium. Now the endometrium is a highly vascularized, as in it's got lots of blood vessels in, highly vascularized lining of the uterus. The uterus, I'll talk about in a moment, but If it's not, or if the egg is not fertilized, then this lining, this endometrial lining, is shed, and that is menstruation. So I said before that the passageway for the menstrual flow was the vagina. Well, that menstrual flow would come essentially from this endometrial lining. And I've done further videos on the menstrual cycle if you want more detail there. So you have this endometrial inner lining of the uterus, highly vascularized, and it's where a fertilized egg ideally is going to implant. Now, I've mentioned the word uterus. The uterus is the site of implantation of the fertilized egg, otherwise known as the zygote, and it's where you get development of the fetus during pregnancy. So you have the endometrium, but the bigger bulk of the muscle, if you like, of the uterus comes from this portion here that I'm just going to label or colour in yellow. That bit there is known as the myometrium. So let's put that in place. Myometrium. The myometrium is the outer muscular wall of the uterus, and the contractions of which expel the baby during birth. So it's the bigger, more muscly, if you like, part of the uterus. So it's an outer muscular wall, and when it contracts, that's going to push, that's going to expel the baby out of the woman during birth. Now let's continue this clockwise, and you can see there's a label at the top, and this one is the fallopian tube, also known as oviduct. So I'll put that in here also. It's sometimes referred to as the oviduct or the fallopian tube. Now, the fallopian tubes transport the ova from the ovaries, so we're talking about the egg here, to the uterus. Now, following ovulation, fertilization may occur here. Now, we can see this quite unusual structure at the sort of opening of the fallopian tube, and it's called the infundibulum. Infundibulum. So infundibulum, the infundibulum. Now, the infundibulum is an open end of the fallopian tube. It's fringed by these finger-like projections which sweep the released oocyte into the fallopian tube. Now, I'm using words like oocyte, ova, and egg. I explain those in much more detail in another video in a process that I look at called oogenesis and egg production. But basically, what the ovum releases is caught and swooped into the fallopian tube by this infundibulum. And this structure here, the infundibulum, appears to almost be grasping. I'll just highlight in red. It's this here, which is our ovary. Now, the ovaries are the site of oocyte production or egg production in a process known as oogenesis, which I'll talk about further in a separate video where I look at also spermatogenesis and the production of sperm. But this ovary is also the production and the secretion, or the site of production and secretion rather, of the hormones estrogen and progesterone. So two functions, site of oocyte production, and it's also the site of production and secretion of the hormones estrogen and progesterone. So if we move further down, if we come down, we can put the ureter in place, and the ureter is the tube essentially carrying urine from the kidneys down into the bladder. We could put the rectum in place also, and that's this one here. Now, the rectum I'm just putting really in place more just for completeness sake. The key one that I really need to look at is this last label, and it's pointing to this portion, and I will highlight this in black, this portion here on the diagram. Now that last label is that of the cervix. Now the cervix is a sphincter muscle. It's at the base of the uterus and it needs to dilate to about 10 centimeters during birth. So cervix, sphincter muscle at the base of the uterus that dilates during birth. Now this portion here, if I were to just colour it slightly in blue there, that region there is known as the cervical canal. In fact, the word cervix means neck. And you can think of it like an opening almost. The cervix is a passage through which sperm, and the cervical canal, rather, is a passage through which sperm must travel to fertilise an egg cell after sexual intercourse. It's also important in fertility, contraception, and as I've mentioned, childbirth. So there we have the key structures identified in this video of the female reproductive anatomy and functions. Okay, I hope all that helps.